Hello, my name is Marissa Malchione, and I am from the Sabin Vaccine Institute's Influenza Initiative. Thanks for tuning into our presentation today on the vaccine R&D ecosystem after COVID-19, where we'll explore some of the implications that the COVID-19 experience will have on the future of influenza pandemic threats. Before we get started, I just want to give a quick thank you to my co-collaborators, Stacey Nobler, Cassidy Howell, Ben McCormick, and Allison Mack, and also a special thank you to Flu Lab, who funds our work. So the mission of the Influenza Initiative at the Sabin Vaccine Institute is to accelerate broadly protective next-generation influenza vaccine research and development. And during the first 2 years of our initiative, we were exclusively focused on influenza. But much like the rest of the world, we pivoted in response to COVID-19, and we recognized this opportunity to learn from that experience and gauge the impact of this pandemic on the vaccine R&D ecosystem more broadly. So specifically, we intend to capture novel and optimized approaches to vaccine development employed in this crisis, to note the enablers of progress as well as the persistent barriers, and finally to assess the potential impact of COVID-era advances on prospects for a UIV. So we recognize that the diverse multi-sectoral community that's now responding to COVID-19, many of which were from the influenza R&D space, are gaining knowledge that can be applied to advance next-gen influenza vaccine R&D. So we wanted to learn how to sustain and harness the extraordinary momentum in the pursuit of universal influenza vaccines, or UIVs, that would provide long-lasting, broad protection against any and all influenza strains. So in order to meet this goal, we are taking a multi-pronged approach, which includes ongoing landscaping and cataloging of relevant scientific literature, policy research resources, as well as public reporting. We also recently conducted a survey to capture quantitative and qualitative data from a broad spectrum of experts that range from the life sciences, vaccinology, pandemic preparedness, vaccine regulation, as well as the policy and funding spaces. So respondents were asked to answer questions and offer their insights related to 3 key topic areas, which include the novel science and technology, vaccine R&D, as well as the drivers and incentives for COVID-19 vaccine R&D. And our third component are interviews with key stakeholders in vaccine development. So for on-camera interviews, we've partnered with a documentarian team for a 12-month exploration of this intersection between the response to COVID-19 and the threat of pandemic influenza, as well as the pursuit of universal vaccine protection against influenza. So these interviews will be released as a video series, culminating with a feature-length film. And then our off-the-record interviews are being conducted as follow-up to further probe some of the themes and questions that were raised by the survey, as well as the on-camera interviews. So in this presentation, I'll be sharing our early findings, primarily from the survey. So in terms of demographics, we had a total of 235 respondents, about a third of which came from academia, another third from biotech and pharma, and then the remaining third was split nearly equally between nonprofit and government sectors. 82% of our respondents were from organizations that are currently involved in COVID-19 response, and respondents represented 46 different countries, with a majority of responses coming from the US and India, followed by the UK. So there were 6 overarching trends that emerged from our survey, as well as from the literature landscaping and the interviews. So during this presentation, I'll share some of the preliminary findings for each of these trends listed here. So COVID vaccine development has really been accelerated by strong fundamental research, as well as emerging science and technology, such as nucleic acid-based and viral vector vaccines, which, as we know, have never been used in a vaccine brought to market thus far. So together, these technologies are represented in about 40% of the COVID-19 vaccine candidates that are currently in clinical trials. And according to the Milken Institute's COVID-19 vaccine tracker, 6 out of 10 of the leading candidates in phase 3 trials are utilizing these technologies, including the recent headline-making mRNA vaccine from BioNTech, Fosun Pharma, and Pfizer. So before COVID-19 struck, these platforms were being explored for use in other vaccines, including next-gen influenza vaccines. So they were ready for rapid response to a novel pathogen. Now, if nucleic acid-based and viral vector vaccines are proven safe and effective against SARS-CoV-2, the knowledge and the momentum that's been gained in their development should then propel progress towards a universal influenza vaccine. So we asked our survey respondents to indicate which elements currently being employed to accelerate COVID-19 vaccine development should carry forward to accelerate development of other pandemic vaccines. And perhaps not surprisingly, the top 3 responses were related to collaboration. And those included formal collaborations, consortia for research and development, and IP and data sharing, as well as rapid publication. Now, an interesting nuance emerged when we asked a similar question about accelerating R&D, but for universal influenza vaccine development specifically. So in this case, respondents ranked scientific knowledge and discovery and accessible reagent standards and models above efforts related to collaboration, which reflects kind of the scientific challenges that we know are posed by universal influenza vaccine development. And again, this indicates that in real time, with respect to COVID-19, collaboration, IP and data sharing, and rapid publication were really top of mind for our respondents. But we know that unanswered scientific questions remain in regard to a truly universal influenza vaccine. So as we think about the lessons that the COVID-19 experience can lend to influenza, new scientific knowledge of vaccine platforms and development should really be transferred back to influenza and next-gen influenza vaccine development. And this can be done when influenza researchers that had pivoted to respond to COVID begin to transition back to their work in the influenza space. So moving into our next topic, the willingness and speed of collaboration across disciplines, sectors, and borders has really accelerated COVID-19 vaccine development. So here, respondents, which are identified by sector, reported collaborations with researchers and experts from fields that aren't traditionally associated with vaccine development. And those include disciplines such as computer science, computational biology, bioinformatics, biochemistry, and physics, just to name a few. So, for example, about 30% of our respondents from the biotech and pharma sectors reported these kinds of collaborations for our survey. So as part of the COVID-19 response, we've witnessed unprecedented levels of collaboration involving academia, companies of all sizes, philanthropies, governments, and multilateral organizations. And importantly, these have occurred both between and across sectors, where partnerships between academia and pharma and public-private partnerships have really flourished. So the question becomes, how can we best leverage current collaborations to inform and incentivize future partnerships that are formed to accelerate development of other pandemic vaccines, such as a universal influenza vaccine? And one thing we do know is that to do so, we will really require a reimagining of traditional disciplinary and sectoral silos. So the open sharing of data and information is really key to collaboration. So we want to identify factors to facilitate those processes. And we know that few institutions explicitly base professional advancement on open and early data sharing and the tangible results that may produce, and instead primarily reward formal publications and funding awards, which collaboration may compromise. So incentivizing data sharing for critical problem solving, whether or not it results in publication, could enhance both international and intersectoral scientific cooperation. So to kind of wrap this topic up, our takeaway is that COVID-19 has really demonstrated the transformative potential of open and early data sharing, and sustaining this momentum could accelerate vaccine development for other diseases with pandemic potential, including influenza. But explicit incentives and facilitating mechanisms will really be needed to make this happen. So moving into our next trend related to investments and funding, COVID-19 has really forced the world to recognize the profound economic cost of a pandemic. So to date, these countries have spent more than 10 trillion US dollars to support their economies, according to the Wellcome Trust. Now, by comparison, the ACT Accelerator projects that less than 1% of that amount, or $35 billion, will fund successful response to COVID-19 through vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and support to health systems. So the lesson here is really clear that it's far wiser to invest in biomedical interventions to prepare for or prevent a possible pandemic than to risk the costs and consequences of experiencing one. Now, COVID-19 has catalyzed a number of new public-private partnerships, such as ACTIV from the NIH, the ACT Accelerator, and COVAX, just to name a few. So we want to assess the impact that these new partnerships will have on innovative vaccine R&D so that we can apply that knowledge beyond the crisis response environment. So for example, as alluded to by the survey response on the left, government funding is important to de-risk vaccine R&D, but it's the public sector that has the ability to produce catalytic and high-risk, high-reward investments in pandemic vaccines. Now, an interesting trend from our survey is that there have been a number of new funders investing in COVID-19 vaccine R&D, with the most significant increases coming from private investment, particularly venture capital, international consortia, and philanthropy. So certain industries that were especially disrupted or damaged by COVID-19 may find it's in their best interest to fund development of vaccines against future pandemic threats, including, for example, next-generation influenza vaccines. So there's wide agreement that new models are really needed for financing pandemic vaccines, and we have two examples of this here. So first, on the left, we'll talk about securitized techniques for commercializing biomedical research. So Fernandez, Stein, and Lowe from MIT's Sloan School of Management explore creative financing mechanisms to reduce investment risk in biomedical innovation through securitized debt. So their two-component model prescribes large diversified portfolios, which they call mega funds, on the order of anywhere from $5 to $30 billion. And these portfolios are made up of biomedical projects at all stages of development that are financed by combinations of equity and securitized debt, which provides access to large sources of investment capital. So the authors note that with enough programs in a portfolio, the potential revenues become more certain and more easily valued by potential investors, which results in them being more attractive from a risk-reward standpoint. And then on the right, we have the Access to COVID-19 Tools, or the ACT Accelerator. So funders of this global public-private partnership include governments, multilaterals, civil society, businesses, and foundations. And the idea is that by investing in vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics, and supporting health systems, this will decrease the severe COVID disease and the disruption that's associated with severe disease and community spread. So that will in turn result in a ramping up of the global economy, which ultimately justifies this investment. So as these models suggest, new or unique structures of pandemic vaccine R&D could benefit diverse investors from across sectors to invest in a way that allows either monetized profits from what's been generated and or insurance against future economic disruption. So now moving into our fourth trend, the response to COVID-19 has not only illustrated the vast potential of product-focused research to develop vaccine candidates, but also the end-to-end support and financing that ensures a path from discovery through to distribution. So as these quotes suggest, respondents of our survey overwhelmingly agreed that product-focused research could really drive future pandemic R&D. But they also emphasize the value of investigator-initiated inquiry to inform discovery. So as this figure illustrates, vaccine development typically involves a series of handoffs, each requiring a transfer of risk from stage to stage. And these aren't always coordinated or ensured from the outset. So it's this sort of build it and they will come approach. But in the past, this approach has hindered novel vaccine R&D, including for vaccines against previous coronaviruses, SARS and MERS. But by contrast, COVID-19 vaccine development has been driven by these cross-sectoral partnerships that we discussed previously in the presentation, and also supported by end-to-end funding. So here we have two examples of recent efforts to advance product-focused approaches beyond the COVID-19 landscape. So first on the left, in Gerald Kusch and Nicole Laurie's August 2020 report to the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, which was commissioned by the U.S. National Academy of Medicine, their recommendation 2 addresses this needed balance between investigator-driven and product-specific R&D. And on the right, we have Wellcome Trust's updated vision and strategy, which was released in October 2020. And this includes an expanded focus on goal-oriented as well as basic research as it relates to new areas, one of which is infectious disease research. So Jeremy Farrar, who is the director of Wellcome Trust, notes that this strategy is really a departure from Wellcome's previous focus on curiosity-driven basic research. So this combination of product-focused research and end-to-end support has significantly compressed the timeline of COVID-19 vaccine development, and it's also identified efficiencies that could benefit and also be applied to the development of future pandemic vaccines. Now, when thinking about streamlined regulatory pathways, when asked to evaluate the potential impact of COVID-era vaccine R&D, 66% of our survey respondents replied that recent changes, particularly with regard to the regulatory process, could permanently shift pandemic vaccine R&D. Our survey respondents cited the importance of early involvement of regulators in vaccine discovery and development. And this really reflects existing sentiments of the need for implementation of harmonization in regulatory processes. So the question really becomes, will COVID-19 vaccine development set that precedent? So when asked what features of the regulatory review and approval process could accelerate development of COVID-19 vaccines, of other pandemic vaccines, and/or of universal influenza vaccines, the top responses across all three vaccine categories were: first, internationally harmonized approval processes for pandemic vaccines. Second was harmonization and standardization of assay data with biological standards. And third was a greater collaboration between researchers and regulators on preclinical evaluation of novel technologies or discoveries. So there's great hope that the accelerated development timelines will produce safe and efficacious vaccines that control COVID-19. But meanwhile, by analyzing and assessing this unprecedented process, we can learn lessons valuable to the future of development of pre-pandemic vaccines, including for next-generation influenza vaccines. So now to our final key trend. So new production methods and distributed manufacturing have supported both the rapid production of as well as the more equitable access to COVID-19 vaccines. So manufacturing vaccines in anticipation of their approval has accelerated or compressed the timeline for bringing a COVID-19 vaccine to market. But distributing vaccine manufacturing across different global regions also promotes more equitable access. So by reducing the distance to the consumer, you're more likely to saturate the market in a way that generates more equitable access, but it also discourages vaccine nationalism. So while these concepts aren't necessarily new, they're being tested in response to COVID-19 in a way that they haven't been before. So the at-risk production and distributed manufacturing of COVID-19 vaccines will serve as a trial for how we leverage these strategies for the production of pandemic vaccines in the future. Influenza is a certain threat. A strain with pandemic potential will emerge sooner or later, and our experience with COVID-19 demonstrates that there are vast benefits to preventing an influenza pandemic rather than responding to one. So this really means that now is the time to protect the world from influenza, and the COVID experience can inform our efforts in many ways. So first, advances in knowledge, methods, and platforms related to novel science and technology for COVID-19 vaccine development must be applied to inform and advance next-gen vaccines for influenza. Collaboration and open data sharing have accelerated innovation and progress, but explicit incentives will really be required for this to persist outside of the context of pandemic response. COVID-19 has also shown the disruption and devastation that pandemics can have on the global economy, and the case has really been made that investment in vaccines pre-pandemic is many times more cost-effective compared to the current situation of response. So the financial commitments must continue to be made towards next-gen influenza vaccines, with considerations towards creative financing mechanisms that decrease risk while enhancing innovation. COVID-19 has also shown the immense efficiency that exists in product-focused research, with a network of partners providing end-to-end support. So applying this comprehensive system to the vaccine discovery, development, and distribution process will accelerate the development of more broadly protective influenza vaccines before a pandemic emerges. COVID-19 has also educated regulators on how to prioritize safety while maximizing efficiency. And finally, a truly universal influenza vaccine should be produced through distributed manufacturing to ensure equitable access. So Sabin is involved in a number of efforts to learn from the COVID-19 experience. For example, the Sabin-Aspen Vaccine Science and Policy Group met earlier this fall to discuss the future of vaccine research and development, and their report will be made available in early 2021. Now, we in the Influenza Initiative will use the work that we've introduced here, as well as a planned convening of diverse stakeholders in 2021 to develop an S&T innovation agenda to accelerate the development of next-generation influenza vaccines. So in closing, I just want to emphasize that COVID-19 has shown us both how devastating a pandemic can be, but also how rapidly the vaccine R&D ecosystem can respond to such a threat. So these lessons really must drive action now in order to protect the world from an influenza pandemic that we know is coming. Thank you again for tuning into our presentation, and we are happy to answer any questions you might have either during this session, or you can find the Influenza Initiative in the Partner Hub.